The guns had fallen silent, but the world still trembled. Along the western edge of the Rhine, where the air once burned with diesel and fear, columns of prisoners now moved through mud and rain. The spring of 1945 was not gentle. It smelled of smoke, rot, and surrender. A gray mist hung over the ruins of Remagen, where bridges lay twisted like broken ribs across the water. In the distance, American trucks groaned across temporary pontoon crossings, engines steady, soldiers efficient, their movements almost mechanical. To the Germans watching, it was unnerving, a kind of order that didn't make sense in the ruins of defeat. Among them walked women, thousands of them, their steps uncertain, their uniforms stripped of insignia, armbands removed. Some had been clerks, others signalers, a few nurses who had patched wounds in field hospitals that no longer existed. They were part of what had been the Wehrmacht's auxiliary corps, and now they were just prisoners. One of them, a 26-year-old named Marta, clutched a tin cup against her chest as though it were the last thing in the world that still belonged to her. Her hair, once neatly braided under regulation cap, now hung loose and damp. Every few steps she glanced up, expecting cruelty, a barked command, a rifle but it never came. The Americans at the wire watched quietly, smoking, offering the occasional word in broken German. Langsam, slowly. All right. This way. The camp at Bad Kreuznach had sprung up almost overnight. It was nothing more than a stretch of open field bounded by barbed wire and wooden stakes, yet even that chaos was managed with eerie precision. Bulldozers carved drainage trenches, engineers strung telephone lines, and tents appeared as if rehearsed. Everything happened with rhythm, not anger, not vengeance, just routine. Marta stood in line beside other women, listening to the distant hiss of rain on canvas. One of them whispered, "They feed us, I heard. Not much, but warm." Another laughed bitterly. Warm? Americans don't even know hunger. A whistle cut through the drizzle. GIs moved through the rows, checking lists, distributing tags. A young sergeant, barely older than Marta, walked past, his uniform spotless, a pencil tucked behind his ear. He spoke without looking at them. "All right, ladies, keep moving. You'll get shelter soon enough." His accent was strange, his tone neither cruel nor kind. It was simply businesslike. That was what confused Marta most. She had been taught to expect hatred. Instead, she found indifference wrapped in efficiency. By nightfall, the rain turned heavier. The camp glowed faintly under dim floodlights powered by a roaring generator. The women huddled under army blankets, their breath misting in the cold air. Somewhere beyond the wire, an American cook stove rattled. The smell drifted over the camp, something warm, something edible. Marta's stomach twisted painfully. For months, she had survived on barley husks, the occasional potato, melted snow for water. In the Reich's final days, soldiers had eaten wallpaper paste and horse meat. Yet here, just a few weeks after total collapse, her captors were boiling coffee strong enough for its scent to cut through the rain. A murmur spread among the women. "Do you think they'll give us food?" "No, they'll starve us." "It's not their way," someone else muttered uncertainly. A truck arrived near the perimeter, its headlights flashing through the mist. The Americans unloaded crates, wooden, stenciled with U.S. Army Quartermaster. They stacked them neatly beside a tent. The labels read Ration D, coffee, instant, flour. Marta couldn't stop staring. She felt suddenly small, fragile in the face of something vast. It wasn't the soldiers' strength that frightened her, it was the system behind them, invisible but unstoppable. The next morning, the prisoners were gathered for roll call. The rain had eased, leaving the earth slick and shining like oil. Sunlight caught the steel pots in the distance, where GIs were already at work. The sound of clanging metal carried across the camp, deliberate, practiced. Then came the smell again. Fried bacon, onions, something yeasty and alive. The women's eyes widened. "They're cooking here?" whispered one. Marta said nothing. She had cooked for soldiers once. If boiling grass soup and scraping ash into thin broth counted as cooking. The Americans worked with a calm that seemed impossible after war. They spoke little, moved with confidence, and laughed occasionally. Laughter. It was the sound she hadn't heard in months. A young American corporal set down a steaming bucket at the fence and gestured to the guards. The women watched, motionless, as he lifted the lid. Steam poured out, white, fragrant, almost holy. Steam poured out, white, fragrant, almost holy. A soldier called out, "Mess starts soon. Line up." The order came through a translator. There was no cruelty in his tone, only discipline. The women hesitated. Marta's knees trembled. It wasn't hunger anymore, it was disbelief. Inside the mess tent, rows of prisoners shuffled forward, each handed a tin plate. On it, a ladle of thick stew, a slice of white bread, even a spoonful of jam. The food was hot. The bread was soft. Marta tasted it slowly, not trusting her own senses. Around her, no one spoke for several minutes. The only sound was the quiet rhythm of spoons against metal. Outside, American engineers refueled the field stoves with gasoline, smoke rising in controlled plumes. It was all part of the plan. Everything, from the delivery of supplies to the timing of meals, ran like clockwork. Even captivity was being managed with a system so efficient it felt unreal. The German women had seen the Reich crumble under its own bureaucracy. Now they were seeing an enemy whose order had survived the apocalypse. As darkness returned, Marta sat near the fence, watching the faint glow of the American camp beyond. A line of trucks hummed in the distance, headlights cutting through fog. Somewhere, music played, soft jazz on a portable radio. The melody drifted over the wire like something from another world. She felt neither hatred nor envy, only a strange peace wrapped in exhaustion. The Americans didn't seem like conquerors. They seemed like men doing a job too large for any one person, but somehow they were managing it anyway. One of the women beside her whispered, "It's strange, isn't it? How they feed us like this, after what we did." Marta nodded, eyes fixed on the faint light of the kitchen fires. "Maybe they feed us," she said softly, "because they can." She didn't know it yet, but that quiet observation held the truth that would haunt her for years. The war had been lost not merely in the trenches or the skies, but in the unseen discipline of men who could turn chaos into order, and hunger into mercy. As she closed her eyes, the wind carried a new scent across the camp. Bread baking for tomorrow. The thunder had ended, but something else, quieter, more powerful, was beginning. At dawn, a thin mist lay over the camp like breath held by the earth itself. The prisoners stirred slowly, wrapped in damp blankets, their faces hollow but calmer than before. Somewhere beyond the wire, a mechanical growl broke the silence, the low, rhythmic sound of engines approaching. Marta rose from the mud and shaded her eyes. Out of the haze came a convoy of olive-drab trucks, each marked with the white star of the United States Army. They rolled forward in formation, stopping with precision near the supply tent. The women fell into uneasy silence. War machines had always meant destruction, but these ones hissed and steamed as though alive. American soldiers jumped down from the vehicles and went to work with the discipline of a practiced orchestra. Canvas tarps were pulled back to reveal shining steel drums, collapsible tables, and strange contraptions mounted on wheels. The women whispered among themselves, "Boilers? Ovens?" The word that passed between them was, "kitchen wagons," though none of them could quite believe it. The Americans moved fast. They connected hoses, opened valves, and soon the air filled with the sharp scent of gasoline mixed with cooking oil. Then came the hiss, a high, steady whistle as flames licked inside metal chambers. Within minutes, smoke began to curl from the stovepipes, white and clean against the gray sky. Marta stood transfixed. She had spent months cooking in the ruins of barracks with nothing but wood scraps and tin pots. The efficiency of this operation felt almost supernatural, like witnessing a ritual from another civilization. A sergeant in a grease-stained apron barked orders over the noise. "Get the burners hot. Water on, coffee next." His voice was rough but not cruel. The men followed each command instantly, their movements rehearsed. One soldier swung open a steel lid, and a cloud of steam erupted, rich with the smell of reconstituted eggs. Another poured coffee grounds into a massive percolator that hissed like an engine. Within half an hour, the camp smelled not of defeat, but of breakfast. The German women stood behind the fence, silent, wide-eyed. A few pressed closer to see. The machines fascinated them, the way the stoves burned evenly, how everything had its place, how there was no shouting, no panic. One of them murmured, half to herself, "This is how they fought the war." Another nodded. Yes, with organization. Marta couldn't look away. Her fingers curled around the wire as she watched the Americans ladle thick batter onto hot plates, turning it deftly into golden pancake. They moved with the same focus she had seen in German soldiers during parades, but without arrogance. There was a rhythm to their work, not born of obedience but of confidence. Each motion had purpose. Each cook trusted the other to do his part. When the first batch of food was ready, the guards began to organize the prisoners. Lines formed quickly, hundreds of women clutching their tin cups and mess tins. The Americans rolled out massive insulated containers and filled them with stew, potatoes, and coffee. It wasn't luxury, but it was nourishment, hot, filling, human. Marta stepped forward slowly, the smell of roasted meat dizzying after so many months of famine. When her turn came, a tall corporal looked her in the eyes and said in broken German, "Eat slow. Hot." His face was sunburned, his hands steady. He filled her tin with a ladle and moved to the next without waiting for thanks. The first spoonful scalded her tongue. It didn't matter. It was thick, real food, corned beef and vegetables, seasoned with something she hadn't tasted since childhood. Tears filled her eyes before she realized it. Around her, others ate in silence. A few laughed softly, the sound fragile and strange in the cold air. Across the fence, the Americans leaned against their trucks, drinking coffee from tin mugs. They looked exhausted but calm. Their camp was a portrait of order. Supply crates stacked in perfect rows, burners burning in synchronization, smoke rising in steady pillars. Nothing was wasted, not a second, not a gesture. The sight began to stir something in the women that wasn't quite envy and not yet admiration, a kind of stunned respect. They had lived through the collapse of a regime that promised efficiency above all things, and yet it had ended in chaos and starvation. These men, the so-called enemy, seemed to have mastered the very discipline their nation had only pretended to embody. Later, Marta would learn the details. That each kitchen truck was part of the M1937 series, designed to cook for 500 soldiers in under an hour. That every soldier operating it had been trained by the Quartermaster Corps. That even here, surrounded by prisoners, their supply chain ran like arteries across Europe, from the ports of Antwerp to the Rhine, from depots that had once fed millions of men in combat. But in that moment, none of it was theory. It was the simple miracle of a hot meal where no life should have been organized enough to provide one. Rain began to fall again, light but steady. The cooks covered the stoves with metal lids, tightening every latch, adjusting flame levels to conserve fuel. Marta noticed how they checked every gauge before leaving the area, as if their enemy's hunger were a matter of duty, not mercy. A private walked by humming a tune, something lively, American, completely out of place among the barbed wire. She didn't know the words, but the rhythm stayed with her. After eating, the women were told to return to their tents. Marta lingered, looking back at the rows of mobile kitchens now cooling under the rain. The steam rose like ghosts in the fog. It was then she realized something that would not leave her mind for weeks. These men could feed a nation as easily as they fought one. That evening, a translator arrived to explain the camp's schedule: morning roll call, rations at dawn and dusk, sanitation duties. The voice through the loudspeaker was calm, efficient, unmistakably confident. You will be fed twice daily. Food will be hot when possible. Follow the lines. The women exchanged glances. Hot food, scheduled, predictable, in a country where even civilians hadn't eaten properly in months. It felt like a strange mercy wrapped inside military logic. When darkness fell, Marta sat with her back to the fence, listening to the hum of the generators and the faint clatter of utensils being cleaned. Beyond the camp, trucks moved again, headlights glowing like fireflies through the mist. Somewhere out there, she thought, other camps must be receiving the same deliveries, the same meals, the same care. It was an empire of logistics, invisible yet unstoppable. She stared at the distant stoves, their heat still glowing faintly in the dark. The Americans were still working, still preparing for tomorrow. For them, feeding an army, even an army of prisoners, was not a gesture of forgiveness but proof of function. The thought unsettled her and comforted her at once. As she drifted toward sleep, Marta whispered to the woman beside her, "We lost to people who can make order out of ashes." The woman didn't answer, only pulled her blanket tighter. Outside, one last truck pulled away, its red taillights vanishing into fog. The sound of its engine faded into the night, leaving behind only the quiet drip of rain and the faint scent of coffee that refused to die. Night came softly to Bad Kreuznach, like a blanket drawn over the shame of a nation. A low wind sighed through the camp's barbed wire, stirring the smell of damp soil and wood smoke. Inside the tents, the women huddled together on straw mats, their bellies full for the first time in months. Yet sleep did not come easily. The mind, Marta discovered, could stay starving long after the body had eaten. She lay awake, listening to the distant hum of a generator and the faint laughter of American cooks cleaning their utensils. It was a simple sound, pots clinking, low voices trading jokes, but to her it felt like something forbidden, a reminder that normal life existed somewhere beyond the ruins. At dawn, a bugle sounded, sharp and sudden. The women rose without orders. Habit from years of discipline made them stand in lines before the guards even spoke. Mist rolled off the fields in pale sheets. The smell of coffee reached them before the voice on the loudspeaker did. Breakfast line, 20 minutes. There was no shouting, no cruelty, only instruction. Marta tied her hair with a strip of cloth and followed the line through the mud. She felt both invisible and watched, a prisoner caught between humiliation and the strange safety of structure. Inside the mess tent, steam fogged the canvas. American cooks moved with that same infuriating calm, wiping tables, stirring vats, refilling thermoses. One of them, a young corporal with freckles and a crooked grin, balanced a tray of bread loaves and whistled through his teeth. When he noticed the women staring, he said something in English that made his friends laugh. Marta couldn't understand the words, but the tone was ordinary, unguarded. It wasn't the language of victors gloating over the defeated. It was just life continuing. When her turn came, she extended her tin bowl. The corporal filled it with oatmeal and a small square of butter. He nodded toward the next cook, who added a scoop of jam, red and shining like something out of a memory. Marta murmured, "Thank you, thank you." The man shrugged and replied, "You're welcome, ma'am," before turning away. For a moment she wanted to tell him that her family had once owned a bakery in Mainz, that she had rolled dough beside her father until the war took everything, but the words died in her throat. What would it matter? The stew from yesterday had warmed her stomach. This meal warmed something deeper. Around her, women began to talk in low voices. They spoke of home, of brothers lost at Stalingrad, of mothers who might still be alive. Someone began humming a lullaby. The Americans pretended not to notice. They kept serving, one after another, until every prisoner had eaten. When the line finally ended, Marta lingered by the tent flap. Outside, the camp was bathed in a fragile sunlight that made everything, even the mud, even the barbed wire, seem touched by mercy. A group of GIs were washing pots by the stream, their sleeves rolled, their laughter echoing faintly. One of them bent to pick up a fallen ladle and glanced at her. Their eyes met only for a second, but something passed between them. Not affection, not pity, just the brief acknowledgement of two people exhausted by history. She looked away first. By noon, the camp had settled into routine. Prisoners sorted refuse, dug trenches, scrubbed their bowls clean with sand. The Americans recorded names, issued blankets, maintained lists. Everything was done with methodical precision. There was no shouting, no spectacle. It was the quiet rhythm of an army that had learned control as a form of strength. Marta began to understand that what frightened her most was not cruelty but competence, the calm efficiency that made even captivity bearable. A week passed. The bruises on the women's faces faded, their voices grew stronger. The U.S. medical officer visited daily, handing out soap and disinfectant. When one of the older women, Frau Keller, collapsed from exhaustion, he knelt beside her and pressed a stethoscope to her chest as though she were one of his own. Marta watched, confused. The doctor barked something to a nurse. Hot soup now. Within minutes, a runner arrived from the kitchen with a metal thermos still steaming. The soup smelled of garlic and thyme. Frau Keller sipped, coughed once, then whispered, "Strange people." That evening, the guards distributed small slips of paper for mail. Most of the women stared at them blankly. There was no one left to write to. Marta folded hers in half, drew a tiny cross in the corner, and kept it in her pocket. The paper felt like proof that someone believed she still existed. Like proof that someone believed she still existed. Later, as she helped scrape the bottom of a cooking pot, she noticed the freckled corporal again. He was cleaning a stove, humming under his breath. Without looking up, he said, "Cold tonight, huh?" His German was awkward but understandable. She blinked in surprise. "Yes, cold." He nodded toward the pot she held. "Don't scrape too hard, aluminum." She hesitated, unsure how to respond. His tone was instructional, not superior. It was the way one spoke to a student. For the first time, she felt the smallest spark of curiosity. Who had taught these men to treat even their prisoners with such measured civility? After supper, as the women sat outside their tents, the sound of a harmonica drifted through the air. Somewhere near the supply trucks, soldiers were playing music, slow, wistful, unmistakably American. The melody wound through the dusk like smoke. Some of the women turned their faces away, unable to bear it. For Marta, it was different. The tune reminded her of evenings long ago, when radio stations still played swing music before the censors called it degenerate. She found herself tapping her fingers against her knee. When she realized it, she stopped, ashamed. The war had stripped them of everything, pride, homes, even names. But these field kitchens, these efficient rituals of feeding, were rebuilding something unexpected: dignity. To be given food without scorn, to be called "ma'am" by the enemy, to be kept alive not as labor but as human, these things unsettled them more than any weapon. Marta felt it most acutely when she caught herself smiling at the smell of bread in the morning. She hadn't smiled in a year. One night, while collecting her blanket from the drying line, she paused near the fence. The freckled corporal was sitting by a lantern, writing in a small notebook. She couldn't read the words from where she stood, but she heard him whisper something like a prayer. It struck her that perhaps these men were not the unshakable victors they appeared to be, but tired souls keeping order to stave off their own ghosts. A sudden noise broke the stillness, the roar of engines from the west. Headlights flared beyond the ridge. New trucks were arriving, larger ones this time. The guards stirred, calling orders. Marta stepped back, clutching her blanket, heart quickening. For an instant, the floodlights illuminated rows of crates marked Food Depot U.S. Army Europe. More kitchens, more supplies. She watched as soldiers jumped down and began unloading in the dark, their silhouettes moving with the same deliberate rhythm she now recognized. Whatever this was, mercy, habit, or power, it was growing, spreading. The Americans were not merely occupying the land, they were feeding it back to life. As the last truck door slammed shut, the lights dimmed and the camp returned to its uneasy quiet. Marta lay down, staring at the canvas above her, the echo of engines still in her ears. For the first time, she wondered what would become of them when this strange order moved on, when the kitchens rolled away, and the world, left hungry again, had to feed itself. By early summer, the camp no longer felt like a wound, it had become a machine that breathed. Every movement, every whistle, every delivery truck fell into rhythm. The women woke with the same sunrise, washed their bowls in the same stream, lined up for food that arrived as predictably as the dawn itself. But beneath the surface calm, Marta sensed something larger pulsing through it all, a system so vast and deliberate that it made her smallness both unbearable and strangely safe. The Americans had built an empire of order, and they ran it with the precision of prayer. One morning, the sky blazed clear and blue, the air sweet with wet grass. The field kitchens stood in neat rows, gleaming like altars in the sunlight. Marta was assigned to the cleaning crew near the perimeter. As she scrubbed a basin with cold water, she heard the distant growl of engines. Another convoy was approaching from the west. The sound no longer frightened her, it was the heartbeat of her new world. The trucks arrived in formation, white stars on their hoods, tires spitting mud. Soldiers leapt out before the wheels had stopped turning. They moved like gears meshing perfectly into motion. "Supplies from Antwerp," a guard murmured. 3 days delay, that's all. Can you imagine? Marta couldn't. The Reich hadn't managed a delivery in 3 months before collapsing. Yet here were men who could rebuild a continent on schedule. She watched as crates were unloaded, flour, beans, medical kits, tin after tin of powdered milk. Each was logged, stacked, covered. No shouting, no chaos, just efficiency that bordered on tenderness. Later, near the kitchens, she saw the freckled corporal again, the one who'd first handed her jam. He was supervising a repair on a stove, sleeves rolled, hands black with soot. When the flame sputtered out, he frowned, adjusted a valve, and reignited it with a careful twist. Blue fire leapt up instantly. He smiled faintly. As if the flame's obedience reassured him that the world could still be tamed. Marta found herself stepping closer, compelled by curiosity more than courage. "You fixed these yourself?" she asked softly. Her German sounded awkward, rusty from silence. The corporal glanced up, surprised. "Some," he replied in slow, careful words. "We learn. Army teaches everything." He wiped his hands and nodded toward the kitchen trucks lined behind him. "These, how you say, our secret weapon." He said it with a half-smile that wasn't boastful but proud. "Feed men, win war. Hungry soldier no good." Marta nodded, though she didn't know what to say. The idea was simple, almost too simple. Victory through breakfast. Yet it was true. Behind every battle, behind every bridge and trench, there had been a stove burning, a system moving food across oceans, across mountains. The Americans didn't just fight wars. They fed them. By afternoon, the sun had turned harsh, the smell of metal and fuel heavy in the air. The kitchens roared to life again, lids clattering open, fire hissing beneath steel drums. Women lined up with their tins, the rhythm so practiced now that it resembled ritual. The cooks ladled stew, filled mugs, refilled pot. Marta noticed how each man did his task without complaint, one stirring constantly to keep the food from burning, another measuring portions with exacting care. They didn't serve out of pity, they served because the manual said to. There was strange dignity in that, a mercy born of discipline rather than emotion. She ate slowly under the shade of the mess tent. The stew was thick, spiced faintly, impossibly rich. Around her, women spoke quietly, the sound low and human again. Someone mentioned that new kitchens were being built farther east, near Frankfurt, maybe even in Bavaria. The idea unsettled Marta, this endless spread of the same machinery, efficient and faceless, rolling across the continent like some benevolent army of gears. In the evenings, she sometimes helped stack empty containers. It gave her a sense of purpose, small but grounding. One night, as she worked, the corporal approached with a clipboard. "You do good job," he said, marking something down. His tone was matter-of-fact. "You worked kitchens before war?" She hesitated, then nodded. "Bakery," she said. "My father's." His expression softened, just slightly. "Bread is good work. Better than guns." Then he looked away, embarrassed by his own words. That night, Marta lay awake thinking about bread, about flour dust floating in golden morning light, her father's hands shaping loaves, the smell of yeast before dawn. She realized with a jolt that she no longer hated the Americans for winning. What she hated was how easily they had restored the things she had lost: function, purpose, rhythm. She envied their order, their confidence, their machinery that never seemed to break. A week later, the camp commander, a tall captain with gray at his temples, gave a short address. He spoke through an interpreter, explaining that the prisoners would soon be moved to permanent housing. "Until then," the interpreter said, "you will continue to receive full rations. The United States Army does not allow hunger." There was no applause, no visible emotion, just quiet understanding. But Marta felt something inside her loosen, an old tension melting into gratitude she didn't want to admit. That afternoon, she watched the cooks dismantle one of the rolling kitchens for transport. They worked in perfect sequence, unscrewing valves, folding tables, securing each component with precision. In less than 20 minutes, the entire structure had vanished back into its metal shell, ready to move on. It was like watching Mercy pack itself up and drive away. As the trucks prepared to leave, the corporal waved at her through the wire. It was a small, unceremonious gesture, but it made her throat tighten. She lifted her hand in return. The engine started, gears grinding softly, and then the convoy rolled forward, each vehicle trailing dust and sunlight. Within minutes, they were gone. The camp felt suddenly hollow without the steady clatter of their work. That night, the women were quieter than usual. The stew was thinner, the bread ration smaller. Marta sat beside the fire barrel, staring at the empty space where the kitchens had stood. She realized that what she missed most wasn't the food, it was the sound. The rhythm of human hands keeping chaos at bay. A younger woman spoke beside her, voice trembling. "When they leave for good," she whispered, "will anyone still feed us?" No one answered. The flames crackled, sparks lifting into the dark like small souls. Marta thought of the corporal's words, "Feed men, win war." Maybe this was the last stage of victory, not guns or flags, but the quiet rebuilding of hunger into hope. The Americans had found a way to make compassion mechanical, to turn mercy into a system. And in doing so, they had built something no regime could bomb or starve away. As the wind shifted, she caught a faint sound from far off, the low hum of engines moving east again. The same trucks, the same kitchens, carrying their discipline toward a world still broken. She imagined them crossing rivers and burned-out towns, feeding soldiers and prisoners alike, leaving behind the scent of bread in places where nothing had grown in years. She sat there a long time, the firelight flickering across her face, the air cold and clean. Tomorrow, new rations would arrive, new routines would begin. But somewhere beyond the horizon, the machinery of mercy was rolling on, and for the first time, Marta wished she could follow it.